Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are in the world. I'm James Lloyd. I'm joining you from Hong Kong, where it is at about 6:30 p.m. So in fact, if any of my many children happen to wander in looking for their pajamas, please don't be alarmed. We have a tremendous panel today, an illustrious group of people, even if I say so myself, only the best people, in fact, as Mr. Trump might say. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves shortly. Before then, a brief introduction. My name is James Lloyd. I am the Asia Pacific FinTech and Payments Leader at EY. I'm a partner in our strategy practice known as EY Parthenon. I myself have been participating in Sibos and indeed InnoTribe for many years. In a former life as a startup, part of the InnoTribe Startup Challenge. I was back as a growth stage innovator alumni, and now for the past few years, I've been very happy to participate in and indeed host this flagship Future of Money session. So in fact, last year, I opened the session with a slide that read, "The history of money is the history of humanity." I quoted Yuval Noah Harari. I know Dave here is a big fan. And Mr. Harari in detailing that the development of money required no technological breakthroughs, but rather that it involved the creation of an intersubjective reality that exists solely in people's shared imagination. So the question for us this year, the question today is, how might this intersubjective reality shift in the coming years? And by that I mean 5, 10, 20 years as we think about the history of, the future of money, whether as a consequence of technological breakthroughs, geopolitical upheavals, perhaps global pandemics, or other forces as yet unseen. What are likely to be the social, political, economic, and even cultural implications of this potential shift? So as I said, an illustrious panel, only the best people. We've got Lana Schwartz, amongst many other things, author of New Money, How Payment Became Social Media. We've got Tom Shack, Chief Innovation Officer at a little-known payments startup called Swift. And of course, we have the irascible David Birch, I think author most recently of The Currency Cold War, Cash and Cryptography, Hash Rates and Hegemony. Again, great titles all around. Perhaps I can now pass it over to the panel, starting with Lana, for brief introductions, please.
Hi, so I'm Lana Schwartz, and as James mentioned, I am an assistant professor of media studies at the University of Virginia. I am also the author of New Money, How Payment Became Social Media, which came out this summer from Yale University Press, which I believe Dave will model for us when his time comes around. And I'm spending this year as a fellow at the Berggruen Institute at the University of Southern California.
And this is the point at which I would usually claim to have read someone's book without actually having done so. I can honestly claim to have read and thoroughly enjoyed Lana's book, and I would highly recommend it. Tom, perhaps an introduction, please.
I'm Tom Shack. I recently joined Swift, the grown-up fintech, as James referred to, in a newly created role as the Chief Innovation Officer. Before joining Swift, and for the last 10 years, I've served as a Chief Information Officer at other market infrastructure companies, including London Clearing House and CLS. And I'm really happy to be here today with such great thinkers on a really interesting topic.
Excellent. Thank you, Tom. And Dave, I had been trying to think of an adjective to best describe you, and I landed on irascible. I hope you take it as the compliment that it is intended. Dave Birch, for those who don't know you, introduction, please.
Well, I'm an author, advisor, commentator on digital financial services. I've been a consultant in the space for many years. The company that I helped to found, Consult Hyperion, was fortunate enough to be involved in one of the great cash replacement experiments that did work, which was M-Pesa, and one of the great cash replacement experiments that didn't work, which was Mondex. And those experiences set me thinking about money, like really thinking about it. And that's where I came across the work of people like Lana and began to realize there's something pretty interesting going on here.
Excellent. So as I said, only the best people, genuine, deep thinkers on the panel, and I'm looking forward to getting stuck right in. So, Lana, perhaps we'll start with you, if I may. I mentioned in the brief introduction a little bit about the history of money, albeit at a very surface level through my Sapiens quote. You yourself have spent a tremendous amount of time and detail on this topic. Thinking about the history of money, what are some of the considerations or characteristics do you think historically that we should be thinking about today as we consider, what the future might look like?
Yeah, so as I mentioned at the top, I'm a media studies scholar, which means I study the sociology, history, cultural dynamics of communication and media technology. And for me, I really situate money and I in my work, I try to situate money as a media and communications technology and then kind of see what kinds of new meaning, new politics, new stories emerge if we take that lens. So, and so I often, the subtitle of my book is New Money, the subtitle is How Payment Became Social Media. And my perspective there is that, we're coming off of a period, kind of the long 20th century, where it felt like money was really a mass media, something we all felt like we understood, something we were all on the same page as. We were using big infrastructures that felt quite centralized, that were, we felt like everyone was using the same kind of state-issued currency in a given region, et cetera. And we're moving into an era where, much like as with money or with media more generally, money is starting to feel more diverse, more less mass, stranger, more social, more tied to technological infrastructures rather than kind of big new technological infrastructures rather than the big kind of legacy systems. And so it's starting to kind of feel strange, and it's starting to feel like more niche than it had been. And so the way I think about it is, mass media was never really all that mass. We tend to think about a time when, everyone was just watching 3 channels. But in reality, during that time, there were many, 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 many newspapers. There were always ways that we, and many of those newspapers, by the way, were quite partisan and quite political. And we always passed information back and forth through gossip channels, over the back fence, through churches. And so it wasn't ever really as mass as we like to think it is. And nowadays, things aren't quite as fractured, as niche as we like to think that they are. So we still, Facebook is so mass that it's hard to think about it as anything other than a mass media at this stage. So I think that it's also worth noting that historically, money has never been quite as mass. We've never really quite had this dominant, overarching, monolithic, state-issued currency the way we like to think that we have. And historically, and even in many cases, most places in the world at present, money has been plural and multiple. So people engage with multiple different kinds of currencies in their everyday life, multiple different kinds of financial infrastructures in their everyday life. And, it really wasn't until after the Civil War, for example, in the United States, that state-issued currency was really centralized and really consolidated. Before that point, most people, everyone in the United States, used multiple foreign currencies, multiple employer and local issued and local scripts. They often, just kept things on the tab, kept just kind of account of their interobligations to each other rather than using money at all. So, and the other point of that is that.
Can I just?
Oh,
Can I just try and clarify that?
Yeah.
Sorry, can I just try and clarify that for my own understanding? So, and again, I know you covered this really, really eloquently in your book, but I hadn't really considered the fact that there was this kind of plural and diverse range of currencies and different forms of money at a national level, at a local level, international level, etc. But is it equally true today, or have we seen that kind of consolidation, the nation state currency? I mean, are we at a point today where there is a greater concentration than historically?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do think so. But one more point I want to make about the past is that in the past, money forms were not kind of consolidated or were not distributed willy-nilly. Rather, they were stratified according to class, according to location, and rural versus city. So, in fact, you had wealthy people not only having much more money than poor people, but in fact using completely different money forms and having a real difficulty for wealthy people and not so wealthy people to even interact economically, to have a kind of social interaction through money. And so one of the things that the nation state is talked about as doing is creating this kind of common economic language, a common economic territory for all citizens of a nation state to feel like they belong, and in fact to be able to have a common economic language to transact with each other. So to kind of answer your question, today I think, yes, the state-issued currency really has dominated. And for the most part, we still think of, we do all of our back-of-the-napkin calculations. We still are constantly converting things into the state-issued currency that's most familiar to us. But I do think that even apart from, Bitcoin or Libra or these various overt kinds of currency experiments that I write about quite a bit in the book that are kind of imagined as social media money, our money lives are actually quite more complicated than we like to think. And I have kind of a section in the book that's meant to be somewhat of a provocation, meant to get us to recognize the plurality of our money, to think about things like frequent flyer miles, various kinds of credit card rewards, Starbucks points, et cetera, as the fact that we already are living with money plurality and we just don't really realize it. But in fact, that's very much a global north, Western perspective in many places in the world. Most places in the world, most people numerically are in fact living with much more explicit monetary plurality. So they're using multiple different state-issued currencies. They're using M-Pesa and that sort of thing. And also in reality, we actually are doing a lot more of this kind of social IOU, account keeping between each other. And that's definitely true in places where traditional kinds of currency are scarce or hard to use. So I do think that we are living with more monetary plurality than we think. And I think one of the major trends going forward is that we'll see that those plural money forms are becoming more and more important in our lives.
Yeah, I think this is such an interesting area that, frankly, I had not really considered before. I mean, speaking to you all as part of the kind of panel prep and reading your books as well, and kind of getting this better sense of this historical plurality, and then really considering where we are today and where we might be going. I guess maybe, Dave, kind of bringing it to you based on some of what Lana has said. I mean, for me at least, I still feel like, in particular, the kind of the dollar dominance. We were speaking previously about certain countries dollarizing. I mean, it seems despite every second week there being an editorial in a newspaper talking about the kind of rise of the digital RMB or Libra or whatever else. In fact, the kind of global dominance of the US dollar continues to increase. So at one level, it feels like recent history has been about consolidation and aggregation. I mean, firstly, is that a fair representation? And then kind of based on your own thinking and your own experience, is that a sign of where we're going? To Lana's point, are we likely to continue to see a diversity, or are we likely to see a small number of dominant players emerge, whether it's the US dollar or whether it's a corporate-backed stablecoin, whatever it might be?
Well, no, I mean, I agree with Lana's fundamental view that we're looking at plurality and diversity. I mean, I think that's, and it's interesting, because I've come to that from a technological direction, not from this kind of wider. But I'll come back to that in a second, because just to take your point about the dollar, I think there are two sort of things to think about that. So if you look at the numbers, the dollar is more dominant than ever in international transactions. But once upon a time, the pound was. And I'm sure, if we'd been having this panel 150 years ago, we'd all be discussing how impossible the idea of using anything other than pounds would have been, because that's the stable currency and blah, blah, blah. So the fact that the dollar is completely dominant doesn't mean anything in that longer sweep. But I think to pick up, I think what Lana's saying is kind of more, it isn't just, are we going to be using Chinese currency instead of dollars? It's, are we going to be using currency? I mean, whether it's dollars or not. And this connection between media, Kocha rather famously remembers that quote, money is a very primitive form of memory, which, really, when we lived in these kind of, this is the Harari thing, when we lived in these kind of Neolithic clans, we didn't have money because we could remember the mutual cross obligations that made society function. I could remember that I had to mow Lana's lawn because she looked after my kids. So, I mean, whatever. I mean, Neolithic people probably didn't. I mean, I'm thinking more sort of Brighton for that. But
lawn maintenance wasn't their primary.
That's right. Exactly. But you see my point, which is she's right. So when you can remember all of these things, you don't, and then you have an economy. There's a fantastic book, Stuff and Money in the Time of the French Revolution. Rebecca sprang about this, where which she makes this point, like before the revolution, like the rich people never used money at all, right? Because if there's a few of you and you can remember who owes who what, everything's done, what we would say in the English colloquial, everything's done on tick. Everything's done on the slate. You don't actually have to, and then you have a periodic reckoning up when the harvest comes in, or whatever. Well, one, and I think the media argument is right, which is when you have this substitute for memory that now operates on a global level, you don't need the intermediary of money in the same way, right? Because effectively the internet and social media and just become an extended form of that memory, that you'll have these periodic reckoning up and transfers between them. So it isn't that I sort of think, well, is there another currency going to come along and displace the dollar? Although, by the way, I have to say, in order to have a significant impact on the US economy, you don't have to displace the dollar. I mean, if you take a few percentage points away from the dollar's use in international transactions, America's costs of borrowing go up significantly. I mean, you don't have to replace the dollar to cause a problem for America. Actually, that's not the thesis in my book anyway. I'll come back to that a bit later on. But there's another string to this bow, I think, which comes from that media direction. So McLuhan said, I think I'm remembering the quote right, I don't have it in front of me. McLuhan said something like, money is a specialist technology like writing. To go to Lana's point about, money is a communication kind of thing. So communication makes me think about information theory and Shannon and the information component of transactions and this kind of thing. There's an informational argument that sits alongside Lana's media argument, and that says, I'll use the Civil War example that Lana just gave. So after the Civil War, there were, I don't know, whatever there were, 50 million state banks all issuing their own money. You used to have these giant registers being passed around the country, so you could look up the banknotes to see who's. And by the way, the risk to all that was credit risk. It wasn't the forging of the banknotes. It was because you didn't know whether the bank had gone bust or not. Well, that's ridiculous. So in terms of kind of minimizing information, it makes more sense to go to a global currency, and then you have this whole theory. I think that somebody won a Nobel Prize, I think, for the theory of optimal currency areas. It sort of made sense, right? But we're moving away from that because it isn't me that's thinking about, like, if we were living in civil war and we're trying to decide on the money we're going to use in a transaction, like that's me and Thomas discussing which money we're going to use. But that's not the world we're moving into. We're moving into a world where it's my mobile phone and therefore my AI supercomputer that's on the other end of that network, discussing with Thomas's AI connected supercomputer what basket of assets they need to exchange to make a transaction take place. So that information theoretical argument, which drove and supported Lana's argument about a national currency as a common communication medium, that doesn't apply anymore because it isn't people doing these transactions. And in fact, you've all seen the same projections that I have about Internet of Things and AI and bots, people are going to be the vanishingly small proportion of all of these transactions. Like imagining money as something that I pass to Lana is ridiculous in this coming environment, because everything is going to be an economic actor. The interconnectivity and the Internet of Things. It isn't just about money between a man and a woman. It's money. It's my TV talking to my camera and buy. You know what I mean? It's so man, woman, TV, camera. It's not about people. You've got to think about the bigger picture.
So an excellent Trump reference there for good measure. So let me just pause for a moment though, Dave, because what I'm trying to understand is there a kind of a natural order or a natural progression to these things? And it may be that there is, it may be that there is not. I mean, I think, we've spoken a little bit about the historical and the kind of diversity. And then, over time, it appears, at least at a national level, that there's been some level of, aggregation, consolidation. Even if we do have, credit cards and e-wallets and everything else, apart from basically air miles, which nobody is humanly capable of equating back to dollars or any other currencies, and that's by design. For the most part, irrespective of these payment media or these forms, we are all, as kind of sentient humans, equating them back to a dollar, a euro, a Hong Kong dollar, a Singapore, whatever it might be. So it feels to me like there has been a somewhat orderly progression from recent history to now. I think where you've gone ahead and said, there's some fundamental shift coming. And I know we've spoken in the past about this idea of a punctuated equilibrium, which I think is a very interesting concept, which we can come back to. But maybe before we jump ahead, whether it's 10 years or 20 years, Tom, I'd like to bring you in kind of on the topic of where we are today. I mean, firstly, I think based on what we said about the kind of history, I think we're about to dive into the future. I mean, fundamentally today, I think in particular, given your background, given your experience, are there technological breakthroughs? Are there, is technology a driver here, or is it more, political or cultural or sociological or whatever else? I guess, from your perspective, how much is technology a key consideration?
Yeah, I mean, technology is definitely a key consideration and an enabler, right? So there's things that we can do today that you couldn't do, 5 years ago. As David said, if we were having this session 150 years ago, we wouldn't be doing it, from our living rooms on our MacBooks, right? So that wouldn't happen. So technology is a big driver, and we won't go so far as to say, our refrigerators are talking to our mobile phones, through AI at this point. But if we kind of bring it right down to today, what's really happened is this has been all being driven by changes in our economy. And that's what it comes down to me. And the biggest transformation right now is how rapid our economy, every part of our economy is becoming digital. So what that means is that, money and payments, connected to money have to become digital as well. And to a large extent, this has been happening for some time. We've seen a growth in e-commerce. We've seen a growth in electronic payments, whether that's at the retail level or through things like e-wallets. But it's been happening for some time. I think what's different now is the acceleration of that, and it's got everybody's attention. And so we need to respond to that. We need to support that. When I say we, I mean people in the payments business. The people that attend this conference. Certainly the primary driver for the new SWIFT strategy is a new digital platform. So this is what we're going to do to try to support these changes in the economy. It's also caught the attention of many central banks. And when we survey and look at the market today, I think just about every central bank is doing something to explore or evaluate options related to central bank digital currency. There was a panel yesterday, and one of the straw polls they did at the beginning was for the participants is who thinks, in what time frame do you think a central bank digital currency will be issued and used? And 0% of the people thought that it would never happen, right? So it's not a matter of if it's going to happen, it's when it's going to happen and what shape and what form it takes. So, I mean, many of the central banks are looking at retail applications and use cases. They talk about things like inclusion, but I'd say it's still pretty early days, and there's a lot to explore. There's a lot to evaluate. There's a ton of really big questions that come out of this as well. You know, what is the role of a traditional commercial bank and a central bank? You know, again, yesterday at the central bank digital currency panel, which was brilliant at Sibos, one of the things they discussed was kind of the one tier versus two tier model. You know, who's going to issue, distribute, use? You know, how these currencies going to be used? Again, in an economy that's rapidly becoming very digital. So, and then again, there's also, you know, very big questions that come out of that for today. Things around privacy, around identity, you know, and there's kind of different paths we can take on that. So on one hand, there's tremendous opportunities, and we need to respond to that, and we need to help the global economy move forward. On the other hand, there's a lot of unanswered questions and really big societal type of questions that need to be answered.
Yeah. Actually, Tom, I'm really happy you brought up CBDCs, or central bank issued digital currencies, at this stage, because I think maybe it helps us bridge the gap. And Dave, I promise we will get back to fridges talking to phones. I mean, I'm not. I mean, I do think it's 20. No, I agree. And I promise you we will come back to 20 years hence. But in the meantime, I'd like to think about kind of 5 years hence. And that's where I think, you know, sitting as I am in Hong Kong, I mean, I'm expecting to be attending the Winter Olympics next year in mainland China. You know, by all accounts, there will be a central bank issued digital currency, or DCEP, as they refer to it, live in some of those cities by then. I mean, it's already in testing. But the reason I think it's an interesting one is, as you mention, Tom, about the kind of digitization of money and the acceleration that we've seen in that, frankly, over the past 100 years, whatever it might be, it feels like it's not been a fundamental change. It's been digitization, but conceptually, we're kind of running on the same, rails, as it were. I mean, what I mean by that is, I don't feel like how we think about money has changed, or even what money is capable of doing. So digitization has enabled for instant transfers and instant settlement, etc. But it feels as if with CBDCs and perhaps some of the kind of cryptocurrencies, and in particular the kind of programmable currencies and this aspect, this, to me at least, to the layman, feels as if it could be one of these punctuated equilibrium moments where, we've had this history of kind of money effectively, effectively performing a set number of functions. But now the technological shift is it can do a lot of different things. I mean, Dave, I know you're not especially a fan of the idea of smart contracts, or at least the language of smart contracts. But, can you, before getting to the 20 years hence, within 5 years, do you think we'll see something meaningfully different about how money operates, not just its kind of digitization?
I do. I mean, I think we're on that cusp. And I can see where this question is going. And I don't want to be disloyal to our hosts, but in some ways, Swift is a very affectionate tribute to the 1970s. And there are some things, it's like CB Radio or Charlie's Angels, it's something that we, it came from that time, and we look at it very affectionately. But in a world of central bank digital currency, it's not transparently obvious to me what it will do, because right now it's an awful lot of messing around to move money from one bank to another bank in the same, let alone around the world. Right? There's settlement and reconciliation and faster payments and clearing and message structures and 8583 gateways and all this kind of thing. But you can imagine in 5 years' time, if you're a farmer in Africa somewhere and you buy your fertilizer and things from China and you sell your soybeans and so on to China, you'll pay your suppliers just by sending Chinese digital currency directly from your wallet to their wallet. There won't be any banks in them, never mind Swift or any of the other networks. If this decentralization continues, and I'm not saying it's good or bad, I'm just saying that that's what the technology tells us, then money becomes much more of an interpersonal, unmediated thing, and it gets closer to what Lana's talking about a social media. So if I send, by the way, Lana is too modest to mention, she wrote a very good book with Bill Maurer called Paid, which is about the artifacts of money as well. If the artifact, so if I send Lana some of my Islamic currency, or some of my art currency, or some of my Manchester City currency, that's a communication between us, which no longer has the mediation of banks or SWIFT or anybody else in the middle. So my personal feeling is that central bank digital currency is much more of a revolution than perhaps it seems at first, because it's being discussed by very conservative people who are assuming that everything else is going to, like, we'll have the central bank digital currency, but we'll still have SWIFT. Well, why? I mean, you know.
I'm not sure I quite follow how.
It exists. Prove me wrong.
I'm not sure, and Lana, I'd like to bring you in this, but I'm not sure, Dave, how that is a revolution. It sounds more like an evolution. In fact, if anything, it sounds like kind of Back to the Future. I mean, really, what you've described is cash. I mean, disintermediated, peer-to-peer. So are we really just talking about digital cash, but not necessarily, digital dollars could be a form of cash, but digital air miles could be a form of cash, or digital art tokenization. What is that? And it's peer-to-peer. I mean, is that an evolution or a revolution? Maybe Lana, if I can bring.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would say
No, please.
Okay. I mean, I would say, we often talk about revolutions, but we never really actually have full and total revolutions. All technological change, and any historian or sociologist of technology, anyone who's not like hawking a particular technology, will tell you that all technological change is additive. This year, the sales of vinyl records surpassed the sales of CDs for the first time in a while. And so, all media forms.
I think that's a vinyl connection. Is that a vinyl collection behind David? I'm not sure. No, sorry.
Oh, no, but it is a collection of books behind David. The idea of the paperless office is older than I am. The idea of the cashless society might be older than Dave. I'm not sure. I think it is. And so we're always anticipating. But instead of a cashless, instead of these big revolutions, instead of paperless, instead what we get are these layered palimpsests of lots of different, our ecologies get more complex rather than, shifting from one massive paradigm to another. And I think that is important to remember, because oftentimes actual technological and thus actual social change happens when we're making other plans. So to kind of do a different love letter to the 70s, I think a lot about the Visa MasterCard network, right? So Dave Stearns, who's a brilliant historian of science and technology, wrote a book about the early days of the Visa network. And that he quotes Dee Hock, who is kind of the visionary behind Visa, as describing a time, meaning the 70s, when suddenly money was now electronic. Money was nothing more than bits arranged on an electromagnetic strip that could be turned into alphanumeric characters and transmitted instantly all over the world. And therefore, traditional banks and traditional governments would no longer have the final say, would no longer be, have a monopoly on money. And when I read these Hock quotes to my students or to industry audiences, almost all of them think I'm talking about Bitcoin. And I say, no, I'm talking about the Visa MasterCard network in the 70s. And then we think, oh, but Visa wasn't the revolution that Hock imagined. And I will note, by the way, that Hock at the time imagined that Visa would not just transmit money, meaning state-issued currencies, but that it could transmit anything. And he was thinking about different kinds of financial assets that were emergent at the time. But he was also thinking about department store rewards and department store issued credit and that sort of thing. And it was the member banks that were more conservative and sort of held back and said, no, we want to set up very particular kinds of debt-based and debit-based instruments that can be transmitted over the network. But there was tremendous struggle, and it was by no means a foregone conclusion that Visa would become what it is today. But so we often think, oh, Visa is no Bitcoin. Visa is just this boring thing. It wasn't nearly as revolutionary as Hawk imagined that would be. But it is also a global network of electronic exchange where I can effectively take my card and use it anywhere in the world. And that's not nothing. I mean, Visa still, forms a backbone of most of my financial transactions. And so we often tell stories about what kinds of technological change are revolutionary and what kinds aren't. And we often anticipate technological change that's going to be revolutionary, and it never really comes. So, I think about the 1990s with the internet, which is another area of study for me, and where we really imagined, the brightest minds, the visionaries of the time, imagined that in the future, the very near future, we would all be homesteading on the electronic frontier. We would be living in cyberspace, and we were serious people were asking questions like, what authority can the meat space governments of the world have over the coming cyberspace? And while we were kind of so busy not wanting to lose that kind of anarchist, kind of libertarian nature of the coming web, what happened, we kind of kept governments away, and what happened was large corporations kind of came in and carved out cyberspace. And today, most of our internet lives are lived through platforms that are governed in a far more centralized way with far more heavy-handed authority, but also somewhat disorganized authority than there might be otherwise. So my main 2 points about kind of applying history to the future is to think about the fact that again and again, we do not get revolution, we get evolution. And when we do get revolution, we sometimes don't even notice it. And we're always kind of looking to the future and imagining alternatives. Yeah.
David, before you jump in, Lana, thank you. David, before you jump in, just give me 1 moment, because I do want to give Tom a right of reply, and I certainly won't ask him to speak on behalf of Swift. But in relation to our two speakers. No. But Tom, in relation to both kind of Dave and Lana's points there, I suppose, 2 questions. One, we spoke about global networks, we spoke about CBDCs, we spoke about potential disintermediation of intermediaries, etc. I mean, sitting here in Hong Kong, as I said, I lead our APAC payments practice as well. I mean, for me, much of what's happening in the US or Europe is not especially relevant domestically in mainland China. In Southeast Asia and India, we have kind of versions of some of these things. I mean, is it true, to Dave's point, that we're likely to see kind of CBDCs kind of disintermediate a lot of these platforms? Or simplifying it to Lana's point, is it that we'll just get new corporates intermediating and potentially in a kind of a fragmented, decoupled world, i.e., we've gotten this far in the conversation without talking about Libra. But of course, Dave, I know it's a big topic in your Currency Cold War book. You've got Libra, and then perhaps you've got the digital RMB, and both signify very different visions of what the future of money looks like. And again, to Lana's point, maybe it's surely a multiplicative future, many different, a variety of, but how do you see some of these things playing out at the kind of corporate and intermediary level over the coming years?
Yeah, so I still keep coming back to this common thread about going digital and how that's accelerating now. And if you kind of look back and then build on some of the comments that Lana made, if you look back at photographs going digital, that obviously led to the demise of Kodak, right? And we don't have to get into the case study of that, but it also opened up a whole bunch of different businesses and good and bad and activities that could be done with digital images. and to Lana's point, a lot of those weren't thought of as at the time when a digital photo was created, right? So whether that's to share them on Facebook or Instagram, or to use them to train a machine learning model for facial recognition, I don't think anybody thought about that when the first digital photo was created. So one point is as things go digital, like payments and currencies, we can kind of anticipate what might happen, but we don't actually know. Right, and that's going to be evolved, and who actually steps up and takes control of those things, whether it's a large corporate or other networks are created, remains to be seen. Now, I'll also take you back a little bit of history on Swift, is that as things go digital, other problems are created. As we go back 40 plus years of why Swift was created in the first place, it's because everybody had their own domestic payment system and didn't talk to each other, and doing cross-border payments were nearly impossible. And so Swift solved a very practical problem at the time, and has continued to evolve that over time to a better and better service. And our new strategy right now is just simply based on the fact that the world's going digital, payments are going digital, currencies are going digital. We don't know what digital currency is going to look like. I'd say most central banks, some are further ahead than others, but most central banks don't know what they're going to look like. They don't know how they're going to use them. They don't know how they're going to control them. They don't know how they're going to work through the kind of the really important policies, whether that's financial inclusion or monetary policy. So the point is, we don't know. That creates opportunities and challenges. And at Swift, we love big, complex challenges, and we deliver industry solutions with a global reach. So we're excited about it. We think it's fascinating, and the role that we can play to move the global economy forward.
I mean, I always love the Kodak reference, not least because I think it's had a couple of leases of life since. Didn't they append blockchain to their name at one point in the recent past? And then even more recently, I think there was a COVID-19 angle to the resurgence of Kodak. Anyway, definitely not one for this conversation, but an interesting sign of the times. Dave, okay, Tom mentioned there, we will have different actors emerge as, with different levels of kind of authority and power. We're already seeing a lot of that, and again, we'll see a diversity of more. One of the subheadings that I'd been thinking for this panel was, who gets to decide on the future of money, and then equally who gets to push back. I think this ties in with your book, and I should say, having plugged Lana's book early on, I will also say that I read and very much enjoyed The Currency Cold War. But this is a big topic of interest to you. So, maybe as we begin to move out from the 5-year CBDC, which begins to see some maybe programmability or interesting elements to it that had heretofore not been possible, as we move out maybe from the 5 to 10 years, who do you see as the main actors when it comes to the dominant forms of can I call it programmable money? Is that even a reasonable description?
I think
where do you see that going?
I think programmable money is a big deal. I think that sorry, just a thing about Kodak. I haven't got the book off my shelf, but I sort of remember from the Christensen the original case study of that. The most amazing thing to me about that Kodak case study is that it was Kodak that invented the digital camera. I mean, the digital camera wasn't something that happened to them and they didn't notice it. It was like happening down the street and nobody told them. Like, they invented it. And it tells you something about corporate R&D and it's a great case study. The point about who gets to say, nobody wants to talk about, it's inappropriate to talk about politics, I think, on a stage like this. But there is an elephant in the room, which is that the choices made about the future of money are not entirely up to individual consumers or corporates, or indeed certain governments. And the dollar's dominance of international, which to people like us is great, freedom and democracy and transactions being cleared through the New York money center banks where transactions can be monitored and if necessary halted, is a very admirable state of affairs. But that sanguine view is not shared by large parts of the planet. Not everybody thinks it's great that America gets to determine their monetary policy. And when it was, Bitcoin cult fanatic lunatics going on about this, nobody much cared. But last year, it was Mark Carney, who was then the governor of the Bank of England. It was Mark Carney who said that we need to do something about, and these are his words, not mine, the destabilizing dominance of the US dollar. So this isn't just about people like me messing around with technology. It isn't about companies vying for control. It isn't even, in some cases, about governments because it's outside their control. But there is a bigger picture here, which is that who runs money is important. I mean, I just said, I was giving my silly example. I said, well, suppose I send Thomas some Manchester City money. I send Lana some Islamic money, right? Well, what if certain kinds of money are acceptable and certain kinds aren't? That's the same as censorship of media in that. So the idea that, there's this free market competing out there for this is not quite true. And the issue of hegemony is an issue which is way beyond our pay grade. But I would draw your attention to the war games that were carried out at the Harvard Berkman Center last year. They did some war gaming around digital currencies, and I can't remember the exact details, but I think basically in America people were sending checks to each other. Oh, they still do, don't they? Actually, that's a bad example. Okay, so in other countries, people were using electronic mechanisms of currency exchange, and China had a successful digital currency which was being used as the de facto international currency along the Belt and Road, and blah blah blah. And they rolled this forward, and it didn't end up with some squabble for wallet share between Facebook and Google. It ended up with North Korea buying and using nuclear weapons. So, we can have some fun talking about air miles and World of Warcraft gold. But fact is, currency is a pretty serious issue, and it deserves much more informed discussion and debate than it gets at the moment. And certainly that discussion and debate, I appreciate that they want input, I hope, from people who understand the technology, a little bit like me. They need input from people like Thomas who understand the corporate structures and organization. But they really need input from the whole reason I got so interested in the work of Bill and Lana and actually the social anthropologists as a whole was because that debate has to be informed by a much wider perspective than what's the cheapest way to move this value from somebody in India to somebody in California. There's a much bigger picture here, I think, James.
But David, just to clarify, like who is the they in that assessment? Because I mean, effectively, if what I understand you're saying is this is too important a topic to leave to the so-called free market, which I think we're all agreeing isn't especially free in many respects, wherever you sit in the world. So who are the they? Are they sitting in a large corporate in Silicon Valley? Are they sitting in a large corporate in Shenzhen? Are they governmental? Are they supra-governmental? Is it tinkers in their garage building the next Bitcoin, or is it all of the above? And if so, is it possible to predict the future of money 20 years out? And I guess that's a question for all three. I mean, sorry, Dave, please.
Well, if you want to predict the future of money, I saw a very good presentation by a proper futurologist once, not someone like me, just who's read a few of Lana's books, but a proper futurologist. And she said, if you want to look 20 years forward, you have to look 40 years back because the pace of change is accelerating. So if you want to see the magnitude of change over the next 20 years, go back 40 years. This echoes Lana's point. You go back to where we are now, Visa and SWIFT and whatever, these are middle-aged now, right? And they can buy themselves a few sports cars, but they're still getting older. And it's time to kind of look at what's coming next. So if you look 40 years ago, there were a certain set of problems, and one of them was that not all merchants and consumers and banks were connected together by a network. So it sort of made sense to make that network. And that, so you ended up with Visa and so on. But now all the banks and all the merchants and all the consumers are connected up by a network. We have a different set of problems. And I don't really want to labor the point, but the revolution, and I disagree slightly with the point about revolutions, but it isn't going to be about the money in a way. I think it's more to do with identity. I think it's more to do with belonging to these communities who can exchange. It's whether you're in or out of the community that can exchange the money. It's about whether you're a citizen or not. It's about whether you're an acceptable person or not. I just feel it's got more to do with identity than banks and accounts and so on.
I think this is a really interesting point and definitely scope for at least one of us referencing a Neil Stephenson book. But Lana, maybe I can bring you in on this. I mean, the idea of these kind of complementary or competitive or overlapping identities, and are there kind of currencies for each of those identities, communities, they're local, they're transnational, all that. This is something I know that you've spent a lot of time thinking about. We're kind of only a few minutes left, but I'd love to get a sense from you around how do you think about that identity and those kind of overlapping considerations, and then also how does money play a part in that going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely think that, identity and money are very closely bound up. The historians who talk about the emergence of national currency talk about it, turning peasants into Frenchmen because suddenly all of our regional, religious, plural identities became national identities, and we felt like we were members of a nation state. But I think our identities have always been plural, and it's interesting that we're starting to think about money that recognizes that. But I do think even within that, the issues that Dave brings up, which is questions of what kinds of money, what kinds of identities are fungible between each other, and who sets the terms of that exchange, are really quite important. And this brings it back to, Tom mentioned machine learning. I'm often asked to talk about questions of access. And I do think that the coming big issues aren't about access per se, because I have no doubt we will find a way, we already do, to, for the most part, allow everyone to engage in the economy, to actually transact. Access won't be a problem, but it will be the terms of access and how those terms of access are defined, controlled, who gets the short end of the stick. And I mentioned machine learning because whether it's deciding that identities and money forms are transactable, whether it's deciding if my fridge can actually order my milk and pay for it, whether it's deciding what basket of currencies I'm going to use to pay for the milk, it's going to be machine learning that does most of those things. And the reality is that for machines learn by making mistakes. A false positive is incredibly useful, or a false negative is incredibly useful for a machine learning system because they're always updating to the real world, to a dynamic context. That's literally how machines learn. However, false positive and false negatives are really bad for vulnerable people. So if suddenly you're not able to access your money, or if your money isn't transactable, even if it's supposed to be, that is as good as or as bad as not having any money at all. So I think the crucial challenge for any technologists using AI, using machine learning to envision the future of money, is to ensure that vulnerable populations are accounted for as we imagine, these new systems.
So I think with just under 2 minutes remaining, I'm going to attempt, almost certainly fail, but I will attempt to kind of try and summarize and synthesize it a little bit, because it feels to me like on one level, we have this kind of evolution or progression. We've gone from this kind of plural and diverse range of monies and forms of payment. And it feels like even though perhaps there's been some consolidation, at least at a national, international level, we still have these kind of myriad forms, and maybe with some of the technological change, we'll have even more. But for me, maybe the big that's the evolution. Maybe the big revolutionary jump, which we won't have time to kind of dwell on now, is that 10, 15, 20 years out where, it's no longer the human at the center. We're no longer the ones doing the calculations between all these various diverse forms of money, but rather it is done in a kind of an automated basis through AI, through whatever new technologies. And that does seem like a big change. It seems like a big shift, and it seems like there could be some real challenges associated with that. We are on time. I mean, quite honestly, a fascinating discussion. As I mentioned at the start, truly an illustrious panel. I've got a lot to think about. I'm going to give each of you 5 seconds. What should someone do who wants to learn more about this, apart from reading one of your books? Dave, 5 seconds.
Watch the movie Middlemen about the creation of the credit card online payments industry and the role of the adult industry in driving payments forward.
Lana, do we have 5 seconds left? I think apart from reading your book, what should someone do to?
Reading recommendation, which I would say read Diamond Age by Neil Stephenson.
I knew we'd get to Stephenson.
I don't endorse it, but I recommend
yes.
it. I don't endorse the vision, but I think it's important.
And maybe Cryptomnicon while you're at it, another great Stephenson book. Tom, what should people do to learn more about this topic?
Study history, and to kind of close it out, we know the most unequal societies, if we realize the risk of people being digitally excluded, will actually lead to a revolution. So if you want a revolution, exclude people. History tells us that.
Wow. A great way to finish. On that note, thank you, Lana. Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Tom. Everybody enjoy the rest of your morning, afternoon, or evening. Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys. That was fun. Really good. Really enjoyable.
Cheers.